is a very dynamic and changing program. We're going to give you the latest and greatest today based on the latest interim final rule. With us to keep on the latest news, we'll be sending out periodic updates that cities and counties will utilize to be able to get the latest information on any rule changes, and of course, some expert advice on how to potentially go about implementing broadband projects under the American Rescue Plan. With that, I wanted to spend a few minutes on an agenda for our webinar today. My name is John Honker, President of Magellan Advisors. I'm also an active project executive for high-profile projects with cities and counties. Spent about 25 years in the telecom industry and 20 of those with cities and counties, helping them build and develop broadband networks that are really transformational. Today, what we're going to talk about is the American Rescue Plan overview, what's really important for you and what's really relevant for cities and counties to know as far as ARP goes, how local governments are thinking about ARP and projects they should be really considering for ARP in their communities, why fiber and wireless is essential infrastructure for cities and counties, the current program rules and final rulemaking, and finally, some practical uses of ARP funding. At Magellan, we're a very practical firm. We like to get things done for our clients, and we like to see results in our clients' communities, which means expanding broadband, building out, helping schools, helping healthcare organizations, helping residents and businesses get more broadband. So we're going to go through some of those practical uses. And today, again, all of the information we're presenting today is based on that interim final rule, which is close to final, but obviously things are subject to change in the final rulemaking, as they always are with any federal program. Again, my name is John Honker, President of Magellan, and I'd also like to introduce Jessica Zufalo.
Thank you, John. My name is Jessica Zufalo. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'm the Vice President of Grants and Funding Strategy. Prior to coming to Magellan, I worked for 5.5 years at the Federal Universal Service Administrative Company, helping to administer the Federal Lifeline Program, which has evolved into the Emergency Broadband Benefit, and did all of our strategic outreach and partnerships with both rural and urban communities and tribal communities. Prior to joining USAC, I worked for 8 years as the Deputy Administrator for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Utility Service, where I helped oversee all of our broadband projects during the Recovery Act back in 2009 through 2011, which in many ways, and I would say, laid the groundwork for what we're doing today with ARP. So it's a real pleasure to be with all of you to go into some detail on how these funds can be used.
Thanks, Jessica. Just a quick note about Magellan. We've been in business for 18 years, helping local governments plan, develop, and deploy broadband networks across the US. And our goal really is to bring more broadband to residents and businesses, to citizens, to help transform their digital experience and to help them compete in the digital economy. We've worked with over 400 municipalities, counties, electric utilities. Over that time, we've helped those communities build over 50 broadband networks with about 1 million fiber to the home connections to households across the US, totaling about $1 billion in broadband investments. We work almost exclusively with local governments. We understand their needs. We really see these projects from the inside of their organizations as opportunities to really help communities, support education, support healthcare, and really help them become more vital and more prepared for everything that's coming in the digital age. And that digital age is here. We've seen that with the pandemic. Those without broadband have a significant disadvantage to those that do. And one of the big purposes of this funding is to really support the growth of broadband and help communities become more vital and staged for economic recovery. Jessica?
Thank you, John. So we'll dive right in here and start talking about some of the key pieces of the American Rescue Plan. This is pulled from my analysis of the interim final rule and the statute. So just to kind of recap, I know a lot of you on this call really are very savvy and understand some of these provisions, but wanted a level set for everybody. So the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund specifically provides about $350 billion in direct allocations to states, territories, tribes, counties, and unis. So really, this is an unbelievable once in a lifetime infusion of capital into local governments, which is, I think, incredible, and certainly nothing I would ever expect in my lifetime. So it's really exciting. Separately, there is a $10 billion coronavirus capital projects fund, which I'll talk a little bit about. So on May 10th, Treasury released $61.5 billion in direct federal allotments to counties. And the county disbursements per county across the country is on the Treasury website. It's really good because it's, I think, a great reference point. The National League of Cities and National Association of Counties also has terrific data that break down the allotments as well, if you just need to pull that. On May 26th, Treasury released the funding allocations for smaller cities of 50,000 or less. So that allotment is based on a formula, and I can help break that down, but essentially just want to make sure you guys know that counties, cities, and smaller cities the funds have been dispersed. Certainly, just to reiterate, broadband is an eligible use case for funding per the interim final rule and the American Rescue Plan statute, which we're going to talk about further into our webinar. And I wanted to highlight something that really struck me. So, having worked at USDA rural development for 8 years, I funded a lot of broadband projects across the country. And at USAC, they fund a tremendous amount as well. So what I learned, what really struck me in reading the IFR is, if any of you have experience with Economic Development Administration projects or USDA rural development projects, there's some real similarities to those pieces that are also in ARPA, because really what you need to do is highlight, how economic harm has been impacted by your community, has been impacted by the pandemic, and as a result, economic harm has happened. It's really in many ways a lot of economic development, pieces that a city or a town or community or county have to highlight, justify, and underscore. But it's very, very similar in many ways to some of the statement of work provisions in an EDA project, I would say, that you should be mindful of. Magellan is working closely with NACO. I sit on the National Association of Counties Rural Broadband Task Force. I'm really honored to be on there. It's just a terrific task force of great people that are just trying to solve broadband infrastructure, last mile, and specifically middle mile deployment problems and challenges, and how ARP can really drive projects. Next slide. I'm going to talk very briefly about the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund, because what I want to really stress upon everybody here on this call today is, in addition to the $65.1 billion that was distributed, there's an additional $10 billion in funding that is coming forth from Treasury. The guidance has not been released yet from Treasury. We're expecting that to be sometime this summer. But it is also available to cities and counties, as well as tribal nations, to fund infrastructure. And specifically, the language in the statute states that it can fund fiber and broadband construction, and specifically broadband projects in response to the pandemic. So a theme that I want to highlight throughout every slide is everything you're thinking of doing in broadband has to be within the context of how the project is going to address economic harm and economic distress in your community as a result of the pandemic. It has to be a link, and it is not hard because local governments have suffered severely during the pandemic. So please keep in mind that any kind of project you're thinking of must have that link. Other eligible use cases are devices, telecommunications, networking equipment, to help communities really meet the needs of their use cases, such as telework, distance learning, teledentistry, teleradiology, telehealth, and any kind of remote, use case to really help meet the needs of communities and improve the quality of life for local government, for communities within local governments. So all projects must demonstrate they meet the critical connectivity needs of the area. And when I read the word demonstrate, what that means to me is any kind of documentation, any kind of data that you can pull. And this is standard for any federal, funding opportunity, is to really have documents that will be made available for the reporting requirements that we'll talk about. Eligible applicants must provide a plan. Now, this is a little different from 602 and 603, which are the two sections of the statute for state and local governments, where it's a direct allocation. In this instance, it is an application. We don't know what the application is going to look like, but we are, we are aware that Treasury is working on this, and we'll be able to receive applications sometime this summer, and guidance will be issued prior to that. Next slide.
So in the framework of ARP, we want to talk a little bit about how this really applies to local governments. Cities and counties throughout the US have a positive impact on broadband. And when we think about ARP, it's been designed to really support broadband, not only in the rural areas, but also in the urban areas. There's no restrictions on middle mile. Last mile is always encouraged, but middle mile is allowable. So when we think about that in the context of ARPA, think about broadband becoming all connectivity within communities, not just fiber to the home, not just residential broadband, high-speed internet, but also broadband to connect schools, to connect hospitals, to connect residents with those organizations for remote learning and for telehealth and telemedicine. It's to help utilities limit cyber attacks by building infrastructure, secure infrastructure that improves the way they do business and improves the security of the grid. And it's also really for local governments to help be more resilient to mitigate the impacts of the pandemic and help them become more efficient and more resilient. When we look at cities and counties across the country, fiber-rich communities are always better positioned for the digital economy. And when we think about how they can be positioned, owning fiber and wireless infrastructure, and predominantly fiber backbone infrastructure, is a key aspect, is a key asset that communities throughout the US utilize to, one, reduce their telecommunications cost, which helps mitigate impacts of budget deficits from coronavirus, support connectivity schools of all their major stakeholders, schools, libraries, healthcare, and public safety, among others, enable smart grid and modernized utilities and secure those utilities. And finally, creating a platform for broadband and enabling options for providers and for themselves to serve their communities. These are all really critical opportunities that owners of fiber infrastructure have. And when we see cities and counties investing in fiber, these are some of the benefits that they receive. So why is ARP so important for local governments? We work exclusively with cities and counties across the US and utilities, and we don't see a lot of funding opportunities come along for urban communities. This is one of those opportunities we believe that creates a situation where you can fund broadband infrastructure, middle mile and last mile, with no matching requirements. You have an achievable 5-year window to spend the funds. You have flexible ways to implement it, right? Effectively, the Treasury is giving guidance to local governments to say, figure out how you can best utilize the funds and come back to us with a plan. Local control and empowerment. We always talk about local choice and local control, and this gives local governments an opportunity to start controlling their broadband futures, not necessarily taking over, but having some assets that contribute to the overall broadband environment in their communities. More fiber is always better. More wireless is always better than less. And ARP gives you an opportunity to utilize funding to start building that infrastructure. And finally, the ability to own wireless and fiber infrastructure really helps you start building a foundation for the digital future of your community. And when we look at what's happening nationwide, we wanted to first send a little shout out to Chris Mitchell at the Institute of Local Self-Reliance, who always so graciously keeps this map updated. But we see cities and counties across the country investing in infrastructure to improve their communities. And in some cases, this may be just dark fiber. In some cases, it may be wholesale. In some cases, they may provide services themselves. If we look at the breakdown of what local governments are doing, we have about 63 instances where the city has decided we're going to become our own ISP and we're going to provide services directly. Now, that's not for everyone, right? Because it's a major step to provide internet services as a retail utility. But there's lots of other ways to do that. 286 cities provide wholesale or dark fiber to providers that help them be more efficient and reduce the cost of bringing connectivity to their businesses and to the residents. And then there's about 71 partnerships out there where the cities or counties own the fiber and the partners providing internet service. In addition to Chris's map, we have over 500 cities and counties that own some fiber in their communities to either connect government offices, schools, hospitals, utilities, libraries. All of these things improve. And again, when we look at ARP funding, eligible uses would allow you to be able to potentially build these networks. So as we mentioned, just to reiterate, projects have to demonstrate how economic loss is mitigated by this funding. Network design and construction costs are eligible if they address one of the following. So this table in front of us really lists the ARP requirement, right? We have to try to meet one of these requirements with ARP. And here are some practical use cases. So the goal here is to help you really think through how you could potentially utilize the ARP funding in your own communities. So for example, improving cybersecurity, an important ARP requirement. A practical use case of that would be a municipal electric utility building its own fiber network to connect substations, AMI, and other critical electric assets, right? To strengthen the grid and secure the grid. Healthcare institution. So a county could expand its fiber and wireless coverage to rural and underserved households, ensuring that they've got access to telehealth services from the local hospital. Schools and community colleges. I think this is one we can all relate to every day. Students that don't have access at home and where major homework gap exists, a county could potentially build out to those underserved students and provide internet access to connect them with remote learning opportunities at the schools. Likewise, the county could build out its fiber to the school and connect that to those homes to have a direct connection and allow those students to be able to access high-speed remote learning and virtual classrooms. And in these cases, again, think about it from the infrastructure perspective rather than who potentially provides the service, because as we work with with cities and counties, we understand that they're not always in a position to operate these networks or provide retail services, but there's always providers and there's always partners out there that will. So when you're thinking about ARP, focus more on the infrastructure opportunity to make those investments than how the network would potentially be operated. Because the biggest challenge is getting the infrastructure in the ground. Then there are plenty of operators and providers that will come to the table. Some other examples, vaccine distribution and public health outreach, right? A key requirement of ARP. A county could expand its fiber and wireless network to community health centers, kiosks, and other facilities to address vaccine distribution, and finally, emergency response due to the pandemic. So a city could expand its 900 megahertz radio communications, its dispatch, its wireless or fiber to the home networks, or build them to support public safety needs and ensure residents are able to receive real-time communications updates. So these are just some examples of how that ARP funding could be fulfilled with some practical use cases. I'm going to now turn it back over to Jessica to answer a couple of common questions around ARP.
Thank you, John. So in our discussions with county governments and local governments across the country, and actually tribal governments as well, we get a lot of really interesting questions. There's a lot of potential, some counties are quite apprehensive. They're concerned. They don't understand about what really the IFR means. There's a lot of activity in the local government communities and at state capitals, and certainly at the Treasury Department. And so one of the questions that I often hear and that folks in local governments ask is, if it's not in the IFR eligibility list, if it's not listed out explicitly, is it permissible? And certainly it is indeed permissible. The IFR contains a non-exclusive list of eligible costs. It can be funded so long as it addresses COVID-19 and the pandemic or the negative impacts. Now, I pulled that directly from the IFR. So I really want to stress this for everybody because, I really hope that people can think about the ARPA structure, as a very broad area upon which local governments are encouraged to do creative things to meet the infrastructure and public health and safety needs of their communities. So I really take them to the Treasury Department at their word, and the Congress when it's stated non-exclusive. Additionally, the IFR provides flexibility to use ARPA funds for which programs are not identified on the non-exclusive list, but which meet the objectives of the statute. So I pulled that directly from the IFR. So I really hope that people feel like, this is kind of exciting because it's giving everybody an opportunity to do things that, it is again, creative, encourages, really great strategies around hardening, security, IT costs, digital literacy costs, connectivity costs, as long as it connects back to the COVID-19 emergency and how it will address the negative impact of the pandemic. Next slide. So I listed out some key dates here. And again, I think a lot of you guys know this, but the Treasury portal is open for registration and to pull your funds. And if you have not done that, I can certainly kind of walk you through it. I know that the National League of Cities and NAGO does a great job in giving people guidance on how to do this, but those who are a little reticent about maybe privacy, they're concerned that the ID.me credentialing is a little difficult, doesn't always work, whatever. I can help you, but I really want to stress to everybody, try, because the portal's open and you don't want to wait any longer if you have not done so. August 31st is the deadline for counties and local governments to submit their first interim report to the US Treasury. So reporting, I think, anyone that's working with federal dollars, as many of you have already in the past, know that reporting requirements are a part of life and you must meet them because this is a federal infusion of capital into local markets, into local communities. And so Treasury really wants to make sure that they know how the money is being used, and that it's being used in accordance with the IFR. So I would think, and the way I would see an interim report is a general summary of how the local government seeking to develop their projects for funding, and link them to the requirements in the IFR. October 31st is the deadline for counties to submit their first quarterly project and expenditure report. So here, this is, a requirement upon which you have to provide, a full budget of your expenditures and how as itemized as possible and how they link to the key requirements and goals of the statute and a project timeline. Any details I'm sure that Treasury would be really happy to have, because that way they can track the funds carefully. And undoubtedly, tracking money at this magnitude, I think is, always important for GAO and for other types of compliance needs. And then December 31st, 2024 is the date upon which funds must be incurred and obligated. So what's exciting about ARP, which is very, very different from CARES. So CARES, distributed money and, told everybody you have to draw down your funds and obligate within a year. Clearly that was, such a tremendous challenge for remote communities, for large cities, for tribes, for everybody, because it's such a short amount of time. The difference here, I think, is that Congress learned their lesson from hearing from local governments and tribal communities about how you can't do that. And so they gave everybody about 5 years, as John mentioned earlier, a 5-year glide path for your period of performance, which is December 31st, 2026. So funds must be expended by then. And I think that provides a nice, a window of time for infrastructure projects, for broadband projects, and really engage in, a large scale construction project. Next slide. I want to leave everybody with a couple of thoughts and to really spur your thinking, to have a conversation with all of you, as you're thinking about your ARP funds and how to get started. I often think about, tips and tricks whenever I'm, developing like a summary for how to move forward with a federal program, to make it achievable, to take it into bite-sized pieces. Because it can be very, very large and extensive. But for ARPA funds, really try to sit down with your teams, with your budget office, with your housing department, with the water and sewer authority, with municipal water systems, with electric co-ops, with utilities, anyone, and sit down with them and think about what your use cases are for the infrastructure, because that will be the basis of, I would say, your justification for funds for reporting purposes. Keep in mind, again, I want to stress the funds are flexible. They can be used in a flexible manner. So there are no restrictions on using these funds for middle mile broadband infrastructure. As John said, the interim final rule states that the funds that Treasury encourages recipients to use it for last mile purposes. However, there are no prohibitions on the funds for being used for middle mile backbone capacity. So, so please keep that in mind. It is very, very important. Create a preliminary design and budget focused on middle mile and fiber distribution within the community. So start thinking about like what your budget's going to look like, how you're going to develop your financial forecast for this, and really think about your narratives that will link the project to economic losses in your area. And as I said earlier, build support within your organizations. The other thing I would say is start also having consultations with the community and document it. Having documentation will help you. So if you work or have lands or your boundaries abut a tribal community or low-income areas, make sure that you consult with them, because I think that it is very evident that the IFR encourages and would probably expect you to do so. Next slide. I will turn it over to John.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jessica. And we wanted to spend some time going through questions. We've got a number of questions here, so we're going to let Melanie moderate those, and she's going to repeat the questions that have come up in Q&A, and then we'll get as many questions answered for the team by 2 o'clock as we possibly can.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, Jessica, for that presentation. There were some questions that rolled in while you were going through the presentation, so we'll start with those. The first question is, we've been working on a broadband plan and know what sites we want to connect. What should we do to be ready for ARP? John, you want to take that one?
Sure. So really thinking about, if you've already got a broadband plan or a strategic plan or feasibility study, that's a great start because that gives you a lot of content to be presenting in your narrative. Now, you don't have to present a narrative in the first round in this existing funding, right? This is more limited to the capital projects $10 billion fund. So the direct payments, you're going to have reporting requirements though, right? So those reporting requirements, any strategic planning you've done for broadband is a great way to really help, tie this back to the economic losses suffered under COVID and really ensure that you've documented the purposes of the funding. The other thing that's important is you've got a head start, right? Because you've done some broadband work in the communities, you know what sites you want to connect if it's a city. And I should reiterate, this applies to both cities and counties equally. So this funding is being provided to municipalities and it's being provided to counties. So either type of organization can use it. So let's say you're a city and you've got your broadband plan and the sites to connect. That gives you a great opportunity to start quickly, appropriate that money and begin moving forward into engineering for your network and then construction.
Great, thank you, John. Second question we have is, could we build a municipal fiber backbone with the ARP fund?
I can answer that, Melanie, because it kind of speaks to the same question that we had initially. So again, municipal fiber backbones would be allowable as we understand it today. So for example, if you're connecting schools, if you're connecting government facilities, let's say you're connecting City Hall, Public Works, your police station, substations out in the field, utility sites for water and sewer, all your pump stations and your PLCs, that all becomes potentially relevant and valid for ARP funding. The goal would be to really, again, show how you're building mitigation into the city with that fiber backbone. And also then think about how that fiber backbone that you're using to connect sites together can also be leveraged for broadband. So for example, if you're passing a opportunity zone or a business district, you're going to leave extra fiber in that area to be able to build out in that district, which could also be an eligible use of ARP, right? Economic recovery by supporting economic development, either through reducing the costs that your local businesses pay for broadband or improving the speed or the competition for services would be a possible use. And again, so think about that fiber backbone as multi-purpose and tie as many ARP goals to it as you possibly can.
Great, thank you, John. And we have a question about unserved residents. We have unserved residents or underserved residents throughout our community. Could we use the funds to bring fiber to the home to them?
You absolutely could. So under the current ARP rulemaking, under the IFR, unserved residents would qualify. So for example, if you didn't have 25x3 service in a particular area, or your residents weren't getting 25/3, right, weren't actually getting that service, or let's say not getting what they pay for, then you have the opportunity to use the funding to build fiber to the home to those residents in those areas. And that becomes a very, very potent use of the funding because you're now really improving household access on every level, right? You're improving their access to healthcare, to work, to education, to economic opportunity. So it really becomes a very potent argument. And we think of one that's very, very demonstrable with the Treasury.
Okay, great. This one, Jessica, this one's for you. You referred to counties, and the question is, I assume city and county is the same date. Is that correct? Can you clarify that, please?
Yes, sure. Hi, Jerry. I'm so glad you joined today's webinar. And yeah, Jerry, absolutely. Cities are, of course, as you well know, eligible reporting. It's the reporting requirements are generally the same except for non-entitlement units. They're a little different. We can talk about that, but for smaller communities of a population of 50,000 or less, that guidance was issued about the distribution last week. But in general, I would say yes. And we look forward to talking to you about it even further anytime after this webinar. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica. And a question about the presentation, about whether we are planning to share this presentation. John, can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we will be sharing the presentation at the end of the webinar. So we'll be sending out a link where you can add your information, and then we'll be giving you, we'll be distributing the presentation to folks who go ahead and register for that link. So you'll see that come out later today. Once you guys get registered on our site, we'll be emailing that presentation out to everybody.
Great. And a great question about economic development. Do you think there is a sufficient nexus to use ARP funds for fiber infrastructure solely based on general economic development goals? For example, businesses were hurt by COVID and businesses generally would benefit from municipal fiber infrastructure, or is that not sufficiently COVID related?
Yeah, we absolutely see that. We see a direct impact, and we have a lot of municipal clients that are taking that route as far as utilizing ARP for economic development, to bolster economic development, right? To get better broadband out to businesses. Remember that there wasn't a specific rule on business broadband, right? The underserved business or underserved was really tied to residential. So we believe businesses are fair game. And if you have specific areas that are suffering from a lack of broadband, or especially in your business community, affordability problems, we think that that's a very, very eligible use of funding based on the interim final rule, and that you could build fiber to reach those impacted areas and then tie that back to your overall economic development strategy.
Great. And another question about the use of funds. Can ARP funds be used for administrative and contractual costs for a person to manage the grants and network implementation? Jessica, you want to take that one?
Yes, you indeed can. There is language in the interim final rule guidance that specifically states that funds for purposes of grants management, operations and maintenance, O&M type costs are reimbursable, and they're eligible under ARP. Definitely. Thanks for the question.
Great. And along the same lines, another question about the use of funds. Would it be possible to use funds to pay for a feasibility study?
Absolutely. Funds can be used for a feasibility study as long as it's tied directly to promoting and addressing economic recovery related to the pandemic. You just have to really tell the story. So absolutely, it is definitely eligible under the category of, flexible uses.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Question here about transportation and broadband. Has there been some thought on how the funding can be applied to transportation infrastructure to connect all cities through fiber and conduit? These connections could then be used by cities to connect to broadband. Is internet required, or can it only include high capacity transport?
Take that. Absolutely. I would say that, integrated infrastructure project that provides connectivity for transportation related uses would, and I think definitely would be an eligible purpose under ARP. specifically under the language that states that projects can be funded specifically for water, water, sewer, and wastewater treatment. So I think absolutely, I would think that if there's a way that you can justify, again, the need for the project and how your municipal water system and transportation systems were impacted by the pandemic, and the city really incurred tremendous revenue losses, there is undoubtedly a link that you could make and how that impacted the community in maintaining a quality of life throughout the COVID-19 public health emergency. And I really like the way you're thinking around this, because that's exactly what I think is one of the creative, flexible uses within ARP that would really meet the letter and the law of the statute. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So related back to the question about building out fiber to the home for unserved, can a small town of 800 households with 100 or so that are unserved qualify? John, you want to take that one?
Sure, Melanie. So the question was really if a small town with 800 households could utilize ARP funding for a fiber to the home build out. We definitely see that as an opportunity, and you definitely could utilize that to build out fiber to the home. One of the requirements in the fiber to the home infrastructure that's built is really to get to 100, right? 100 megabit symmetrical service to provide a higher level of broadband, right? The goal is not to replace what's there with something similar or slightly more, slightly faster, or slightly more reliable, but to really make a jump into fiber. That's why they've really set that 100 megabit as the de facto standard for building out to residential communities. So for example, in a small community of 800 homes, ARP could be leveraged to complete the engineering design and the construction of that fiber to the home network for those residents that don't have access to 25.3. And the 25.3 is interesting because and I apologize, the 25.3 is the current FCC standard for broadband, 25 megabits down, 3 megabits up. Not very fast as it stands. So when you're thinking about building out in that community, understand what people have today and where they lack 25.3, go after those households and really build a narrative around the fact that we're a small community. We don't have access to necessary broadband. We have available funding, and it's going to help all of our community be able to support digital inclusion. It's going to help us support work from home. It's going to help us support telehealth, telemedicine, and remote learning. Those are really important to focus on in your narratives and in your reporting.
Thank you, John. Another question here about using this money for match. So a point of clarification, can this money be used as match for any other federal broadband related programs? Jessica, you want to take that one?
Sure. I've seen a lot of questions on this chat that we're getting about whether ARPA funds can be used as a match. I want to make it very, very clear to everybody that ARPA money is prohibited from being used for federal matching, as a federal match for other federal programs. Generally, I would say overall, that's always prohibited. It is always prohibited that a federal funds can be used as a match for other federal programs. It's usually never, ever allowed. However, if you have a state broadband program, or if the funds that are coming through your local government, your city, your county, your tribal community, those funds can be used perhaps for a state match. So let me be clear. So you cannot use your ARPA money as a match for, let's say, USDA, the Reconnect program. You can't use it for any other match, but you can use state money. You can use like the money that came to cities and counties as a match for in many cases for non-federal programs. So like a state program. I hope that is clear, and I'm happy to speak to you offline to provide more clarity on that. But There's a very bright line between how you can use federal money for match, which is in most cases, no. And there is no match mandate. The other thing I want to mention is that this money does not require, I believe John mentioned this earlier, none of the ARPA funds requires a match, none of it. Okay, let me stress that. None of the ARPA funds require a match. It is direct allocated payment to the local unit of government. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, for that clarification. We've got a three-part question here. I'm going to give this one to you, John. So the first part is asking about connections to POPs, internet points of presence, as a tie-in to serving underserved. This is really backbone versus middle mile. Second part is the Treasury going off the FCC broadband map for unserved or served by wireline eligibility? And the third part of that question is whether capital one-time expense versus ongoing operational costs and IRUs are considered.
Okay, thanks, Melanie. So to answer that first question, connections to POPs as a tie-in point to serving underserved, we believe if it's part of the project, backbone, we can use backbone and middle mile interchangeably in this scenario. So we would consider that POP being part of the backbone, and under the current rulemaking, we believe it would qualify for funding. The second part to that question, which I think is tied in, is actually the third part regarding whether IRUs are allowed. So IRUs, as they're defined, or indefeasible rights of use, are considered capital leases, and we would believe that would qualify for funding because, again, it's a capital cost of not necessarily construction, but of plant that's necessary to light the network, right? To get the network online and actually have backhaul connectivity to the project area. So we believe the IRUs would be allowed. If any rulemaking changes on that, we're happy to reach back out, though. And then the second part to that question is actually the Treasury, whether the FCC broadband maps are being used to define unserved, underserved. As we know today, they are. But we also caveat that with, we know that those maps are not always correct. I think everyone on the phone understands that FCC broadband maps in some cases are not fully accurate, and that local due diligence on those maps is important to prove out whether 25.3 really exists there or not. We've worked with numerous communities and had to actually revalidate the maps, and we found considerable difference between the established FCC broadband maps and the results of the maps that we work to create, and that increased the eligibility areas considerably in a number of communities, meaning that they've been treated as they can be built out. So we think, stay tuned for more on that. That's really an important question. It's a detailed question, but it's very, very important into the overall eligibility of underserved areas.
Great, thank you, John. The next question is, what is the risk of disqualification for any future funding allocations from additional follow-on down round ARP type programs if there is not meaningful use of ARP funds in this round? Jessica, you want to take that one?
Sure. So let me just kind of reiterate a couple of things I mentioned earlier. 50% of the total allotment is available now. So 50% of your total is available to you for the next 12 months. And after 12 months, as of May 10th, the remaining 50% is available to you. There are very specific reporting requirements where you must provide to the Treasury a budget, narratives, documentation as to how the funds are being used. If the funds are being misused, meaning if they are being used for purposes that are not at all linked to the coronavirus pandemic and the broad eligible categories listed in the American Rescue Plan, it will likely be deemed, a violation of your agreement with the federal Treasury, and there is indeed the ability of the Treasury to claw back that money. So my my strongest advice is to make sure that whatever you're spending your ARP funds on are expressly directly connected to economic recovery, public health and safety, infrastructure upgrades and investment, all do, and pay to essential workers. All of this is illustrated, but these are all broad general use case categories. It all has to be linked back. If it is not linked to that, the Treasury is likely to conduct an audit. And the penalty is that at a minimum, the monies will be clawed back. And if you would like, I can speak to you about this in more detail offline, but it's very important that everybody understands, do not veer away from the general blueprint of ARPA. And that's just, that's just good fiscal management, funds control management that you have to exert. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. It looks like we have time for a couple more questions. Here's another one. NTIA envisions public-private partnerships, public build-out, and private operation. It looks like the dark fiber programs you provided operate along those same lines. What is your experience on funding success with public-private partnerships as opposed to municipal ownership and operation? John, you want to take that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Melanie. Thanks. As far as public-private partnerships go, we spend a lot of time working on those with communities, and everyone is very, very different. I think one of maybe the misconceptions of public-private partnerships is that the local governments don't have to put up all the stakes and the capital, and sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. I think what we find is that the more capital that the local government brings to the table, the more control and the more incentive the private partner is going to have to effectively operate and also be incentivized to operating. So we always see municipal ownership as important at the physical layer, meaning fiber infrastructure, just like cities and counties own roads, streets, water, and sewer, and electric. When we get to operation, then it's really a customized approach, right? We have to look at what network is being built, right? Because the more passings we have, the larger pool of demand we have, the more attractive that's going to be to private partners. We have to look at who those potential partners are in the market. So for example, what are the qualifications of these different ISPs that could potentially operate the network? And then for local governments, the most important thing is, if you're putting up the money, are you willing to give up some control? Because we're not only taking away some of the risk, but we're also giving up some control in the network. And this is something we've seen local governments be challenged with, because they're putting up the capital, but effectively someone else is operating the network. And in some cases that works fine. And cities and counties are able to get to a good deal with the provider, and they're able to operate effectively. In other cases, the provider and the city or the county may be at odds in terms of their goals and the alignment of the partnership. So I would say it's a very, very case-by-case basis. Public capital is absolutely critical, because remember, in the cases where broadband hasn't been upgraded, in a lot of those cases, the private sector can't find a way to make the necessary return to upgrade. And the public's got to come along. The public organizations have to come along and contribute to that, to really help bring the level up, right? Help reduce barriers to entry, help reduce the capital investment that's necessary, so these providers can meet their return requirements. I think to leave you with two things: one, public investments necessary in the infrastructure level. Private operations, it can be effective and it can be ineffective depending on the type of arrangement that the local government creates with its operating partner.
Great, thank you, John. So we have reached the end of the hour here. If we did not get to your question, sorry we weren't able to get to it, but please feel free to reach out to us. Be happy to address any of those questions offline with you. John, Jessica, any final thoughts that you'd like to leave everyone with?
Well, first of all, we appreciate everyone attending the webinar today. We know everybody around the table is busy, especially now. You're recovering, right? Your communities are recovering. You're finding ways to do more with less, and we're here to support you. We really have wanted to provide as much information as we can on ARP, and please subscribe to our updates so that you guys can stay informed, as this is a fast-moving program. Rules are in final development, and we really want to keep our city and county brethren informed and update on the latest information. Jessica, any closing comments from you?
I just wanted to thank everybody for your time and attention today, and feel confident that this is possible. This is doable. Don't feel intimidated. It's a bit intimidating, but it's completely doable. I've been through the first stimulus, and so it's amazing what can be done. And I just want everybody to feel confident and fearless that you really can and should, leverage these funds to really meet a once in a lifetime investment opportunity in your local community. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John and Jessica. We appreciate the presentation today, and thank you all for attending. We hope to talk to you all very soon. Take care.